please join me in welcoming our president.
Thank you very much, Charlie. After this introduction, I'm too embarrassed to speak. Thank you. All right. So as Charlie mentioned, today I'm going to talk about job creation life cycle of firms. It's always a pleasure to talk to this group, and I figured that you've always heard me talk about financial sector issues, so why not make a change and talk about something else today. All right, so as many of you know, jobs are quite important policy issue these days, particularly in the developed world after the global financial crisis. But all around the world, job challenges are huge. Worldwide, about 200 million people, many of them youth, are unemployed and looking for work. Another 620 million of them are neither employed nor looking for work. And just to keep employment rates constant, around 600 million new jobs will have to be created over a 15-year period. Because of all these issues, the World Bank actually did a World Development Report recently focusing on jobs, but not on jobs only as labor demand, but much more as driver of development, and also ensuring the stability and social cohesion in countries. As many of you know, that instability in the Arab world and around the world is often associated with inability to get employed. So this policy challenge also motivates the talk that I'm going to give today, and it is mostly based on a number of research papers that I'm working on with Meghna Yagari and Vojislav Maksimovic. Some of these are published and some of these are ongoing work, so your comments would be very much appreciated. So we start from the fact that entrepreneurship and small firm growth is considered to be a major driver of economic growth and job creation. So we want to know more about what are the facts and what are some of the policy conclusions. So I'll structure the talk around three main questions. The first one has to do with who creates jobs in developing countries. Believe it or not, we don't have a very good answer to this. At least we didn't before we started this work. Second big question has to do with firm dynamics. So how are firms growing as they age? Are firms with high growth potential actually born different? So do they have characteristics internal to them that separate them from the other firms? Or are they made? So are there institutional factors that sort of influence their growth patterns? And also we want to know more about what determines success in the early life cycle of the firm. If you've been following the entrepreneurship literature, you know that there's often this difference that's made between subsistence entrepreneurs, those people who try to sort of find jobs on the side in order to complement their income, versus high growth entrepreneurs. Those are the ones that are going to employ and generate jobs and drive growth. So we're interested in potentially trying to understand these issues. Okay, so let's start with the job creation. This is based on a paper that we recently published in the Small Business Economics, and essentially this sort of uses a large database across the world. It's the World Enterprise Surveys that the World Bank does. It covers over 100 countries and about 50,000 firms. Over the period 2006 and 2010, and we use this rich database to try to examine the relationship between firm size and age in employment and productivity growth. And we do have a particular focus on small and medium enterprises because of the billions of dollars of aid portfolios that go into supporting these enterprises. And we focus on the formal sector because this is where a lot of the good data is. But it's also true that when you look at, again, the growth promoting employment and the productive investment, it's often in the formal sector, not in the informal sector. All right. So now in this area, as I briefly mentioned in the introduction, the existing evidence is quite sparse. In the developed world, past studies have shown mixed evidence on firm size and growth relationship, but some of the more recent evidence by Haltiwanger and his colleagues suggests that essentially when you look at the relationship between firm size and job creation, once you control for the age of the firm, there isn't anything systematic left there because it is the startups and surviving young businesses that are critical for job creation. It's not the small firms per se, so you should not be romanticizing these firms. And some other evidence looking at also productivity suggests that indeed larger firms are more productive. So these two are important for shaping our thinking going forward in the developing countries. And we also know that there is really very little systematic data on research on developing countries as far as the employment generation. As I mentioned, we're using World Bank Enterprise Survey data. These are obtained from each country's statistical office. Based on the universe of eligible firms, there's a random sampling with replacement. And the strata are industry, firm size and geographical location, and we have the sampling weights, therefore we can make inferences about population. And finally, we have, after cleaning up, etc., we have about 50,000 firms over 100 countries. And the mean response rate in these surveys are about 70%, which is pretty high when you think about the other studies using surveys. Of course, there are caveats, as always true with a lot of this type of international cross-country data. We have only the formal sector and only the survivors, so there's survivorship bias potentially influencing the young firms more. We cannot talk about micro-enterprises because we don't have firms with less than 5 employees for the most part. And the results on age are conditional on size because we don't have age strata, although within strata everything's randomly sampled. And the analysis is at the establishment level, not at the firm level, but we do know that 86% of the establishments are actually single establishment firms, so we can deal with that. All right. Okay, so very quickly on the most important variables, total employment. So employment is defined as the number of permanent full-time employees. We have this for individual firms, and we can aggregate up to the country level since we have the firm weights. And as far as job creation, we look at the change in the number of permanent full-time employees over 2 years. So we have the information for last year and 2 years before, so the change gives us the job creation. We have size classification dummies. We group them into 3 categories. 5 to 19 employees considered to be small firms. These are the reference category. 20 to 99 employees, the middle-sized firms, and those firms with 100 and more employees, so considered the large firms. This also corresponds to the size stratification in the surveys, and fairly robust as to where you look at which point in time you look at these figures. So let me show you some summary statistics. So when you look across the world in all these countries, so the figures are calculated by country and then averaged. Here we have the medians, but means are not all that different. We do see that large firms are the largest contributors to employment with about 54.6%. But it's also interesting to see that small and medium enterprises are together are sort of significant contributors to overall employment as well. So they have almost the other half. And if you look at countries by income, you do see that as the income of the country increases, the share of employment in large firms grows. So there is a negative association between GDP per capita and small firm contribution to employment. And if we look at next job creation shares, we see a switch here. Small firms tend to have the largest shares of job creation. So this is true in the countries where there is net job creation. We have 85 of them in the sample. And also true in the countries where there are net job destruction. So even there, we have 18 of those in the sample. Small and medium firms seem to be generating jobs. And a lot of the job destruction here in the sample is actually coming from large firms. So we do look at this a little bit more carefully within an empirical setup next. So we try to look at either growth in employment or sales or labor productivity, and we regress these on size dummies as well as the age. Age is defined as the number of years since the establishment began operating. Industry dummies, year dummies, country dummies, and I'll show you OLS results clustered standardized at the country level, but the results are robust if you want to do weighted regressions as well. So what we find here is we do see that in developing economies across all those countries that we're looking at, small firms have higher employment growth and sales growth. And because those are the category that's left out of the regressions. And what's interesting here, I think, is this also holds true even though we control for age, which is in contrast to the US findings where all these, in very similar, identical regressions, the size dummies go away once you control for age. All right. So, but productivity growth, okay, on the other hand, is different. So you see that large firms have higher productivity growth. So these, I think, are interesting sort of findings that we're going to come back to. Okay, so we also wanted to look a little bit at the age, but as I said, we are a bit more constrained in this database vis-a-vis our conclusions on age, given the potential problems, given that the sample is not stratified by age, and there's likely to be greater survivorship bias when it comes to younger firms. But when you look at, I think still these sort of figures are interesting and illustrative of what's going on. When you look at firms after categorizing them into 3 groups according to their age, so less than 5 years, between 6 to 10 years, and 11 plus years, you do see that large mature firms are the largest contributors to total employment. So that's the light green column over there. And when you look at the sort of job creation figures again, you do see what you've seen before. Even once you control for age, the role of smaller firms stays. So in the countries where there is a positive job creation, small firms and young firms do create most of the jobs, and this is even the case when you look at countries where there are net job losses. So, and then here looking at this a little bit more in a regression setting and introducing the age dummies. Essentially what you see is that conditional on size, youngest firms have higher employment growth, sales growth, and productivity growth. But the size issue is still there with us. Now, in sort of summarizing the findings from this part of the study is we do see that SMEs are comparable to large firms in their contribution to aggregate employment. And essentially, small firms make the smallest contribution to employment, and this is there's this inverse relationship with income and SME contribution. But we also see that, unlike in the U.S., small firms are important contributors to total job creation, even after one controls for age. So. But the interesting point here is also that small firms also have lower productivity growth than large firms. So their large size in different countries raises questions about potentially resource misallocation. So what do we say here? This interesting relationship between job creation and lower productivity growth might also explain why job creation does not always translate into higher growth. Long time ago, I wrote a paper with Thorsten Beck and Ross Levine, which sort of caused a lot of problems because what we were saying is that a large share of SMEs in the countries, although were associated with growth, was not causally related to growth. So this was a sort of not a message that people who were interested in promoting SMEs wanted to hear. And a lot of this new findings are, again, consistent with that. So we certainly want more jobs, but not jobs for jobs' sake, more better quality jobs and growth promoting jobs. And so a lot of these findings question why isn't more productive firms having a larger sort of market share? Is it lack of competition? Is it barriers to entry? So it raises questions about business environment, obstacles to growth, innovation, entrepreneurship. So it just led us to think that we really need to better understand firm life cycle and how firms grow or not grow as they age. So this brings me to the next part of the talk. So we know that in developed countries, new businesses start small, and if they survive, they actually grow fast as they age. But there, again, when it comes to developing countries, there's little systematic evidence. If anything, there are individual studies in India and Mexico by Shea and Kleno, which got a lot of attention because they showed that the life cycle of manufacturing plants there is either flat or declining. So again, raises a lot of questions about resource misallocation in developing countries. Is there something that particularly harms large establishments and discourages investment in organizational capital? So what's the issue? What are the more important things there? So this is what we want to, again, look at. So do developing country firms grow as they age is the question. And this is a paper that Meghna, Max, and I are working on, again, using enterprise surveys. And we ask two main questions. First, we want to know what happens to firms as they age. And second, we want to know, again, what is the determinant of the differences we observe in the life cycle across countries. Okay, so we want to know to what extent factors internal to the firm or external to the firm are important here. So here's a summary figure that tells a lot of the story. you can see that in the sample of 120 countries now, the average 40-year-old plant employs nearly 5 times as many people as the average plant that is less than 5 years old. The firms have a flat life cycle. And the figure, the corresponding figure in the US here is about 7. So they're growing, on average, they're growing a little bit slower, but they're still growing. We also had to explain a little bit the reason for our different findings from Shea and Kleno. It turns out that their sort of study covers informal as well as formal firms, whereas obviously informal firms dominate a lot of the developing country sort of samples, but they're more, as I said, subsistence type of firms, and you know, they don't even sometimes survive the entrepreneur himself. Once the individual sort of grows old, he may be stopping the operation. It's not necessarily the same notion when you think about the firm life cycle. These individuals in the informal sector don't have the vision or the ambition to grow and generate jobs. They're just trying to do something on the side in order to put food on the table. So anyway, so when we look at this country by country, it's interesting that this upward sloping age size profile is quite pervasive in the vast majority of the countries. So only in less than 10% of the countries, firms that are younger, firms that are 40 plus are not larger than young firms. But there's also a great deal of variation across countries. For example, in about 22% of the sample, which is 27 countries, firms grow at rates that's faster than they grow in the US. So, I mean, since you always think about US as having the best institutions, there must be something else going on here in terms of explaining the variation. So we want to know what explains this age size gap as firms age. And we do something fairly simple. We do a variance decomposition to examine the relative influence of firm effects compared with country effects without assuming a structural or a causal explanation. So on the left-hand side, we have variation of firm size at different ages, or variation in growth since birth, or variation in productivity for that matter. And on the right-hand side, we look at various things. It's firm characteristics or country characteristics. The bulk of it is explained by institutional factors. You know, country dummies capture pretty much the maximum that you can explain across countries. And we do look at institutional characteristics that's been investigated in the literature. And also, we look at some firm level characteristics that we hope capture some of these things that are intrinsic to the firm. Okay, so what do we see here? What we see is that essentially country dummies capture about 5% of the variation, and around 30 to 40% of that is due to institutional factors. But we also find that initial conditions, the firm characteristics also have very high explanatory power, particularly size at birth is a very interesting factor, which seems to have quite a significant explanatory power. So, in here, so this makes us think that there is something that's internal to the firm that is important in explaining the firm life cycle. Now, another thing that's very interesting is that when we look at firm productivity and how that varies, it is the institutional factors that are much more important. So when you look at productivity differences, institutional factors make much more sense, have much more explanatory power. But when you look at job creation again and increase in size, it's actually internal factors. So that brings me to the last part of what I will talk about, and this is very much ongoing work and preliminary, so again, your thoughts are very welcome. Here we try to look at now the very early life cycle, and we do use the enterprise surveys again, and we have those results which pretty much support what we see here, but I'm talking about more the Indian panel results here because the database is much cleaner, and we wanted to, since we're looking at the very early life cycle, we did not want to suffer through the survivorship issues as much. So what we do is we look at firms for the first 8 years. We use Indian census data. And this is a panel from 2000-2010, and it's mostly the formal manufacturing sector. Clearly, besides availability of data to study the early life cycle, India is an interesting country for us because it's such an important, significant developing country, but it also has the benefit of having states that are very different institutionally, and there have been persistent differences across these states. So much so that The Economist had an article suggesting that if you were to look at India in terms of GDP, you could put different countries in the states, and in terms of GDP per capita, again, you can put different countries. So it's almost like having a cross-country study within the country, and that's what we do. So, so I will tell you give you a preview of what we're finding. We find that size at birth is a key determinant of success over the early life cycle of the firm. So we look at firms and split them according to different size categories. Here what you see is the bottom 2 quintiles of size distribution versus top 3 quintiles, but different ways of splitting doesn't really matter. It's still there. Those firms that start small end up being small after 8 years, and those firms that start large are still large after 8 years. Now, we also look at the growth rates, and although here it seems like there is a little bit of a diversion towards the end, this result is not really that robust. And essentially, the growth rates of small and large firms, or initially small versus initially large firms, do not diverge. So they're pretty much statistically insignificantly different from each other. So there is this remarkable persistence based on how you start your operation. So how you're born determines what happens to you. And it is, we've tried and we are trying so many different things, from capital structure to sort of external financial dependence, to whether you're in a labor or versus capital type of industry. Everything that's been tried in the literature does not seem to matter. Size issues seem to trump performance in the early life cycle. So we also, of course, want to then look at what makes large entrants different. So large entrants seem to have higher labor productivity. They seem to have much more complex production structures, and they tend to do much better in richer and more financially developed states. And I'll talk about this financial impact in a second more. And in terms of, again, looking at what determines size at birth, income level of the state. The richer the state, the greater size at birth. Potentially, there is some emerging studies that suggest that demand factors have a lot to do with the the proper, optimal manufacturing rules. And so in poorer states, you observe smaller firms. In terms of a level of financial development, we see that this does play a dual role, again, consistent with some of the earlier literature. Financial development reduces the size at which establishments can enter, but it also helps large entrants succeed. Literacy rate is another important factor. This, again, you'd expect it to correlate with managerial ability and the internal character, entrepreneurial ability of the individual. And indeed, higher literacy rate allows greater size at birth. And in terms of the business environment, again, we see similar results to financial development. It makes it possible for firms to enter smaller, but helps large firms succeed. So essentially, if I want to conclude here, our work is motivated by the fact that entrepreneurship and firm growth is an important driver of job creation and economic growth. So we want to better understand the micro elements of that. Understanding firm life cycle is an important part of that for designing policies to promote growth and entrepreneurship. So our comprehensive look at over 100 developing countries suggests that, in contrast to US, small firms and SMEs account for a significant proportion of employment and job creation in developing countries. And so there is actually abundant small firms and entrepreneurial activity. But what is different is that these small firms have lower productivity growth than large firms. So one wonders why they have a larger share. And then we look at the life cycle. We do see that in developing countries, firms grow as they age, but often not as fast as they do in the US, although there's quite a bit of variation, as I've just shown. And we want to see, again, what are some of the forces that hold back firm growth in developing countries in order to sort of guide some of our policy work. We do find, there are three main factors for which we find support. Some of them are external, some of them internal, clearly. Institutions, limited access to finance and other business environment restrictions that range from entry and labor regulations, taxes, corruption. These are particularly important in explaining productivity differences across the world. Now, there are also important differences when it comes to internal factors, and we believe these are because of differences in human capital, managerial ability, and we try to capture this with different firm characteristics because we don't have good indicators of this, but size at birth being an interesting characteristic that potentially captures these things, we find that to be a very important variable, particularly explaining sort of employment growth and sales growth. And we also think there is some sort of evidence supporting the importance of demand factors, because the differences in demand may influence the nature of the production process and therefore may influence entry size and growth. And we do find things to be different in states that are richer versus poorer. So I think going forward, there is much more to study. So I think about this keynote as asking more questions than answering them. And I do hope that it provides some inspiration to you in the audience to do more of this work as well. Thank you very much. Bye.